Life in America is about to get harder, and I want to start with the number that convinced me. Norway had 0 mothers die in childbirth. 0. Switzerland had about 1 per 100,000 births. Sweden about 3. In half the wealthy countries studied, fewer than 5. The United States in 2024, according to the CDC's own report, had 17.9, and in 2022 the figure was 22.3, which was more than 55% higher than the next worst developed nation on the list. Not slightly worse, 55% worse than the second worst. And for black mothers in this country, the rate was 44.8. Nearly every demographic group of American mothers dies at a higher rate than all mothers in peer nations. That is not a healthcare statistic. That is a measurement of whether a society actually looks after its people. And at the same moment, 7 companies now make up 35% of the entire S&P 500, the highest concentration in the history of the index. Both of those things are true right now. Let me explain why they are the same story. Brace yourself sounds dramatic until you hear what it actually means. There is a phrase people use when they want to warn you without frightening you, and the phrase is brace yourself, and it always sounds vague. It sounds like something you say when you have nothing specific to offer. But when someone who has spent 50 years watching markets says it, and then you ask them what it actually means in practice, the answer turns out to be remarkably concrete. It means this: plan your life as if times will not be easy. Sit with that, because it is different from what most of us were taught. The default assumption in this country for 2 generations was that things generally improve, wages rise, houses appreciate, your children do better than you did. And so people planned accordingly, which meant taking on obligations sized to a future that was expected to be more comfortable than the present. Planning as if times will not be easy inverts that. It means sizing your obligations to the worst plausible year rather than the average year. It means the mortgage you can service on 1 income even though you have 2. It means the car you can pay off rather than the one you can lease. It means a cash reserve that exists specifically to be boring and to sit there doing nothing. And the specific advice that follows from it is genuinely unglamorous. Build a reserve of cash. Get yourself a useful job, something that in a larger sense pulls its weight in society. Upskill or change skills. Learn something mechanical, something that involves fixing and repairing, engineering, things that need humans, research and science. And then, in the middle of a list of financial advice, make friends. Make sure you live in a tight society if you can. That last item is the one people skip past, and it is the one I want to come back to at the end, because it is not a consolation prize tacked onto financial advice. In the argument being made, it is load-bearing. Now, why would anyone say all of this now? Why would times get harder rather than easier? The case rests on several things that are individually documented and that together describe a country pulling in a direction most people have not fully registered. The first is that the last 10 or 20 years have already been tougher than what people were told to expect as children. Harder to buy a house, harder to afford rent, jobs getting scarcer, or at least less secure. That is not a forecast, that is a description, and most people watching this already know it in their bones. The second is the argument that it is likely to get worse rather than better, and I am going to walk you through the evidence for that. And the third is the deepest one, and the one that has almost nothing to do with economics. It is the claim that the social contract in this country is dissolving. That is a big statement, and it deserves to be tested against something measurable rather than accepted as a mood. So let me test it against the number I opened with, because that is exactly what it was offered as, a measurement. But before I do, let me make the cash reserve advice concrete. Because build up a little reserve of cash is the kind of thing everybody nods at, and almost nobody executes. Here is what it actually means in practice. The standard advice for decades was 3 months of expenses. That number is obsolete for most people. And here is why. White-collar job searches in this market are running 6 to 9 months, not the 2 to 3 that the old rule assumed. So 3 months of expenses is not an emergency fund, it is a delay. 6 months is the realistic target. And notice the word expenses, not income. You do not need to replace your paycheck. You need to cover what actually has to be paid. So the number you are aiming at is your genuine monthly floor, meaning housing, utilities, food, insurance, transportation, medication, and minimum debt payments. For most households, that floor is meaningfully lower than their current spending, which makes the target less frightening than it first sounds. Where it sits matters, and this is where people leave money on the table. An emergency fund earning almost nothing in a traditional savings account at a large bank is losing purchasing power every year with certainty. High-yield savings accounts at FDIC-insured institutions, Treasury money market funds, and Treasury bills have been paying multiples of that. On a $20,000 reserve, the difference between a few basis points and something reasonable is meaningful money for about 20 minutes of setup. What it is not is an investment. That is the discipline that people find hardest. The reserve is supposed to be boring, liquid, and available on a Tuesday with no tax consequence and no risk of being down 30% on the exact day you need it. It is insurance, and insurance is not supposed to earn you anything exciting. And the sequencing question people always ask, pay off debt or build the reserve? The reasonable answer for most people is a small starter reserve first, roughly 1 month of the floor, then attack high-interest debt aggressively, then build the full 6 months. Without any reserve at all, the first unexpected expense goes straight onto the card you were trying to pay off, and the cycle never breaks. That is what brace yourself actually means at the level of a checking account. Now let me show you why he thinks it is necessary. He calls maternal mortality the single best measure of civilization, and the American number is brutal. Here is the argument, and I want you to follow it because it is more rigorous than it first appears. If you want to know whether a society actually functions, do not look at its GDP, because GDP measures total output and says nothing about who receives it. Do not look at the stock market, because that measures the value of assets owned overwhelmingly by the top decile. Look instead at how many women die giving birth. Why that number? Because childbirth is universal. It is not optional. It happens to people across every income level, and the medical knowledge required to make it safe has been settled for decades. A country that fails at it is not failing from ignorance. It is failing from distribution. So here is the data, and I have checked every figure. According to the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics report published in March of 2026, in 2024 there were 649 maternal deaths in the United States, for a rate of 17.9 per 100,000 live births. That was down slightly from 18.6 in 2023, but the decline was not statistically significant. Now the comparison, the Commonwealth Fund studied the United States against 12 other wealthy nations. In 2022, when the American rate was 22.3, it was more than double, and in some cases triple, the rate in most other high-income countries. In half of the countries studied, there were fewer than 5 maternal deaths per 100,000. Norway recorded 0. Switzerland was about 1.2, Sweden about 3, and the American rate was more than 55% higher than the second worst country on the list. That is the part that should stop you. It is not that America ranks last among wealthy nations. It is that America ranks last by an enormous margin. The gap between the United States and second to last is larger than the gap between second to last and the middle of the pack. Then look inside the American number, because the averages conceal something worse. In 2024, the rate for black women was 44.8 per 100,000, against 14.2 for white women and 12.1 for Hispanic women. Earlier data showed American Indian and Alaska Native women with the highest rate of any group. And The Guardian, reporting on the Commonwealth Fund analysis, made the observation that I think lands hardest. Nearly every demographic group of American mothers dies at a higher rate than all mothers in peer nations. Read that again. It is not only that the disparity within America is severe, which it is that even the best-off group of American mothers is doing worse than the overall population of comparable countries. Now, here is the part that matters most, because the mechanism turns this from a tragedy into a policy failure you can point at. The United States is not short on obstetricians. The American supply of OB-GYNs is roughly 12 clinicians per 1,000 live births, which is comparable to many of the countries beating us. The difference is midwives. Sweden has an OB-GYN ratio of about 12 per 1,000, essentially identical to ours. But when you combine obstetricians and midwives, Sweden has about 69 care providers per 1,000 live births. The United States has 16 because we have roughly 4 licensed midwives per 1,000 live births. 69 versus 16. Same number of doctors, radically different total care capacity, because other countries integrated midwifery into their health systems and America largely did not. The Commonwealth Fund's own conclusion identified an undersupply of maternity providers, especially midwives, along with lack of access to comprehensive postpartum support, including maternity care coverage and mandated paid maternity leave, as contributing factors. So the failure is not medical mystery. It is staffing model, coverage, and postpartum support. 3 things that are policy choices. And the reason this is presented as a measure of the social contract is straightforward. Every other rich country looked at the same problem and decided collectively to solve it. We decided effectively that it would be handled by whatever coverage each individual happened to have. That is the social contract question in one number. And there is one more layer to it that I think makes the point even sharper. The CDC data shows the maternal mortality rate for women age 40 and older was 62.3 per 100,000 in 2024, 5 times the rate for women under 25. That matters because the average age of first birth in America has been rising steadily, driven substantially by the economic pressures we have been discussing. People are having children later because they cannot afford them earlier. So the financial squeeze and the mortality number are not two separate problems. One feeds the other. A country that makes family formation expensive pushes childbearing later, and later childbearing carries higher medical risk into a system that already handles that risk worse than any peer nation. And the McKinsey Institute for Economic Mobility has projected that if current trends continue, the Black maternal mortality rate in this country could nearly double to 94 deaths per 100,000 by 2040, which would put that population on par with low-income nations. Now, I want to say clearly that this is fixable, and that saying so is not optimism, it is the actual finding. Every peer country that beats us was not born with better outcomes. They built them, mostly in the second half of the 20th century, through specific decisions, integrating midwives into the standard care model, guaranteeing coverage through pregnancy and the postpartum year, and mandating paid maternity leave. Those are 3 policies, not a cultural transformation. 3 policies that most of the developed world adopted, and we did not. Which brings me back to why this belongs in a conversation about money at all. It is offered as evidence, not as a separate topic. The claim is that a society either has a functioning agreement to look after its members, or it does not, and that when it does not, the consequences show up first and most visibly in the places where individuals are least able to protect themselves. You cannot out-earn a maternal mortality rate. You cannot budget your way around a staffing shortage. And that is precisely the point being made about what happens in this country when something goes wrong and you are not wealthy. When corporations built the stadium, they meant something by it. Let me get at the social contract from a different direction, because there is an observation here that I think will resonate with anyone over 50, and that is genuinely difficult for younger people to picture. The observation is this: when he arrived in America decades ago, corporations had a sense that they owed something to the community they operated in, the city they operated in. They would build the stadium, they would sponsor things, they would be part of the place. And now they are, in his words, cold-blooded profit-maximizing international enterprises. Now I want to be careful, because nostalgia is a trap, and the past was not a golden age. Companies in the 50s and 60s polluted rivers, discriminated openly in hiring, and crushed unions. Nobody should romanticize it, but something specific did change, and it is worth naming precisely rather than vaguely. What changed is the answer to the question, who is the company for? For a long stretch of the 20th century, the operating answer at large American firms was something like a balance. Shareholders, yes, but also employees, customers, and the community where the plant sat. Executives frequently lived in that community, their kids went to those schools. The company's name was on the Little League jersey because the plant manager's kid was on the team. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 80s and 90s, that answer was replaced by a much cleaner one. The company exists to maximize shareholder value. That idea was argued for explicitly, adopted deliberately, taught in business schools, and encoded into executive compensation through stock options, which aligned management's personal wealth to the share price and to nothing else. And it worked, in the sense that it did what it was designed to do. Share prices rose enormously, but look at what fell out of the calculation along the way. If the sole objective is share price, then the stadium is a cost with no return. The pension is a liability to be offloaded. The plant is an asset to be located wherever it is cheapest. The workforce is a line item. And the community is a place you operate in, not a place you belong to. None of that requires anyone to be evil. That is the crucial point, and it is why anger at individual executives mostly misses. A CEO who decided to keep a plant open out of loyalty to a town at the expense of shareholder returns would be replaced by the board within 2 years. The system is doing exactly what it was configured to do. Now, what does this mean for you concretely? Sitting at home. It means that the implicit deal a lot of Americans thought they had, where you are loyal to a company and the company is loyal back, no longer exists on the company's side, and has not for some time. Many people are still holding up their end of an agreement the other party terminated decades ago. That is not a reason to be cynical about your work. It is a reason to be clear-eyed about your position. Which practically means never assume tenure protects you, keep your skills current and portable, Maintain relationships outside your employer, and never let your entire professional identity live inside one organization that has no reciprocal obligation to you. And when the layoff comes, and for many people it eventually does, understand that it was not about you. 15 years of good performance is not a defense against a restructuring decision made 3 levels up by someone who has never met you. People take those decisions as personal verdicts on their worth, and they spend years recovering from something that was, on the other side of the table, a spreadsheet. Nobody in a large institution is ever going to warn you, and there is a reason. Now here is the piece of this that I think is the most useful single idea in the entire conversation, and it explains something people find genuinely baffling. The claim is blunt. Big companies cannot advise you. It would be suicidal for their business. You are on your own. Do not wait for help, because no help is coming. That sounds cynical. It is actually structural, and the mechanism was described a century ago by John Maynard Keynes, and it goes like this. Large enterprises almost never call the big turning points. Not because the people in them are stupid, and not because they are lying to you. Because calling a turning point requires taking career risk that no rational person inside an institution will take. And the central political skill in institutional life turns out to be this: never be wrong on your own. Think about what that means. If you are a fund manager, or an economist at a bank, or an analyst at a research house, and you believe an asset class is dangerously overvalued, you have 2 choices. You can say so publicly, ahead of everyone else. If you are right, you look brilliant, eventually, possibly years later. If you are early, which is the same as wrong in this business, your clients leave, your assets under management collapse, and you are gone before you are vindicated. Or you can stay with the crowd. If the crowd is wrong, everyone is wrong together. Nobody gets fired for that. It is described as an unforeseeable market event, and everyone keeps their job. Keynes put the underlying logic memorably. You can be wrong in company, you can jump off the cliff together, and you will never lose your job because of it. But if you do anything on your own, sooner or later you will get it wrong, and you will not receive much mercy. So the incentive facing essentially every professional whose commentary you consume is to stay close to consensus, hedge everything, and never be conspicuously early. Once you understand that, an enormous amount of financial media makes sense. The relentless mild optimism, the way warnings always come wrapped in enough qualification to be unfalsifiable. The fact that almost nobody said anything clear before 2000 or 2008 until it was already happening. They were not all fools. They were rationally protecting their careers, and the structure rewarded them for it. And here is the practical consequence for you. You cannot outsource this. The institutions are not going to tell you when to be careful, because the ones that tell you early get punished, and the ones that tell you late are not telling you anything. Which means the only viable approach is to look at the data yourself, and the encouraging part of this argument is the claim that follows. A bubble is not actually hard to see. The description is a picture. There is this kind of plain, a long, relatively flat expanse, and then there is a Himalayan peak that goes up almost vertically and eventually comes back down. You do not need a finance degree to recognize that shape. You need a chart and the willingness to look at it honestly rather than through the story you would prefer to be true. So the instruction is simple and hard. Have the courage to look at that, make your own conclusion. Get out of the most dangerous part and do it now rather than waiting for permission. Let me show you what the chart currently looks like. 7 companies are 35% of the entire index, and that has never happened. Here is the data, and I want to give it to you carefully, including the honest counter-argument, because this is where people get hurt by one-sided commentary in both directions. The 7 largest American technology companies, the ones commonly called the Magnificent Seven, peaked at approximately 35% of the total market capitalization of the S&P 500 in early June of 2026. That is the highest concentration in the history of the index. For context, the average weighting of the 7 largest constituents since the index was created in 1957 has been roughly 17%. And the previous record was approximately 26%, reached during the energy boom of 1980 and reached again at the peak of the dot-com bubble in March of 2000. We are meaningfully above both of those. Widen it to the top 10 companies and Goldman Sachs data puts them at roughly 39% of the index, which is well above the 27% peak reached during the technology bubble of 1999 and 2000. Historically, the top 10 have averaged around 24%, and before 2023, the last high point was 28%, back in 1970. The trajectory is startling. 8 years ago, those 7 companies were about 12.4% of the index. By 2022, they were 21.6%. Now roughly 34 to 35. Their combined market capitalization went from about $2.2 trillion to over $22 trillion. And look at the divergence underneath the headline. Since the beginning of 2023, the American stock market gained a cumulative 95%, but the S&P 500 Equal Weight Index, which treats every company the same rather than weighting by size, gained roughly 50%. The Magnificent Seven returned about 150%. So the market you have been told about and the market most companies actually experienced are two different markets. Now the honest counter-argument, and it is serious. In 2000, the largest 10 companies traded at a price-to-earnings ratio of 43, while the rest of the market traded at 21, a premium of more than 100%. Today, according to Goldman Sachs data, the top 10 trade at a P/E of about 31 against 21 for the rest. A real premium, but far smaller. More importantly, in 2000, the largest 10 companies produced under 20% of the market's earnings. Today they produce about 30%. So a meaningful portion of their higher market value reflects genuinely higher earnings power, not pure speculation. That distinction matters, and anyone telling you this is simply 1999 again is skipping it. But two things sit on the other side of the scale. First, valuation of the whole market. The S&P 500's cyclically adjusted price-to-earnings ratio, the CAPE ratio developed by Robert Shiller, has exceeded 37 on only 39 occasions since 1957. Meaning current valuation is higher than roughly 95% of historical readings. Historically, after readings above that level, the index has averaged negative returns over the following 1, 2, and 3 years. That is not a prediction. It is a historical base rate, and base rates are what you have when you do not have a crystal ball. Second, Morgan Stanley's chief investment officer has noted that the Magnificent Seven are currently as expensive relative to the other 493 companies as the biggest stocks were at the dot-com peak, and warned that this kind of concentration can produce greater volatility and the potential for significant drawdowns. So the sober reading is not that this is definitely a bubble that definitely bursts tomorrow. It is that concentration is at an all-time high, whole market valuation is in the top 5% of history, and the earnings underneath are genuinely stronger than in 1990, but not strong enough to make the arithmetic comfortable. Your index fund stopped being diversified, and most people have no idea. Now let me make this practical, because for most people watching this, the exposure is not in a trading account. It is in a 401k or an IRA, in a fund they chose years ago and have not thought about since, and this is the part that genuinely matters. Here is the thing almost nobody has been told. Buying a standard S&P 500 index fund no longer gives you broad diversification. For decades, the entire case for index investing was that you were spreading your money across 500 companies in every sector of the economy, so no single failure could hurt you much. That was true, and it was excellent advice, but an S&P 500 fund is capitalization weighted. It does not hold 500 equal slices. It holds each company in proportion to its market value, which means when 7 companies grow to 35% of the index, 35 cents of every dollar you put in goes to those 7. And there is a self-reinforcing loop underneath it that people rarely see. As those companies grow, passive index funds are mechanically forced to buy more of their shares, which pushes their valuations higher, which increases their index weight, which forces more buying. The flows are not making a judgment. They are following a formula. That was wonderful on the way up. It works identically in reverse. And we already got a demonstration. In early June of 2026, the Magnificent Seven collectively shed approximately $2 trillion in market value over a few weeks. Because those 7 represent more than a third of the index, their decline dragged the whole S&P 500 down even while hundreds of mid-cap and value companies were trading positively. Read that carefully, because it is the practical lesson. Investors who believed they owned 500 companies discovered that their portfolio was being driven by 7 and that the other 493 doing fine did not save them. So what do you actually do? And I want to be clear that I am not a financial advisor. This is general information, and you should take any of this to a fee-only fiduciary who is legally obligated to act in your interest. The first thing is simply to look. Open your retirement account and find out what you actually own. Most fund providers show the top 10 holdings and their percentage weights right on the fund page. A very large number of people are about to discover that 3 different funds they own all hold the same 7 companies at the top, which means they believe they were diversified across 3 funds and were actually concentrated. The second is to understand the equal weight alternative. An equal-weighted S&P 500 fund holds all 500 companies in the same proportion, roughly 1/5% each. It gives you the same companies with dramatically less concentration. It has lagged badly during this run, which is exactly why it is worth understanding, because it lags when concentration is rising and leads when concentration unwinds. The third is genuine diversification across categories that behave differently: small and mid-cap, international developed markets, bonds appropriate to your timeline, real assets. The point is not to predict anything, it is to make sure that no single outcome can take everything. The fourth is specific to anyone within about 10 years of retirement, and it is the most important one in this section. Look up sequence of returns risk. The short version, a large decline early in retirement while you are drawing down, does far more permanent damage than the same decline later, because you are selling assets at depressed prices to live on, and those shares never recover. Two retirees with identical average returns can end up in completely different places based purely on what order the good and bad years arrived. If you are in that window, your allocation matters more right now than at any other point in your life. And the fifth is temperamental rather than technical. Do not act on this in a single day out of fear. Panic selling is how people convert a paper decline into a permanent loss. Look at your actual allocation, decide what mix you can live with through a bad 2 years, and move toward it deliberately. The instruction was to get out of the most dangerous part, not to get out. Get a job that needs humans, and here is how to tell which ones those are. Let me turn to the career advice, because it was oddly specific and I think the specificity is the point. Upskill, change skills, learn something mechanical, fixing, repairing, engineering, things that need humans, research and science in general. Notice what is not on that list. Nothing about coding, which was the universal advice for 15 years. Nothing about finance. Nothing about anything that consists primarily of producing documents. So what is the actual principle underneath it? I would put it this way. The work most exposed right now is work that is routine, codifiable, and performed on a screen. If your job consists mainly of taking structured information in one form and producing structured information in another form, and you do it sitting at a computer, that is the profile that is currently under pressure. The work least exposed has some combination of 4 features. It requires physical presence. Somebody has to be in the room, under the sink, on the roof, at the bedside. You cannot remote in to replace a water heater. It involves unpredictable physical environments. This is the one people underestimate. A robot can do a repetitive task in a controlled factory beautifully. Crawling into a 100-year-old crawl space to diagnose why a pipe is leaking, in a configuration that exists nowhere else on Earth, is a wildly harder problem than it looks. It carries legal liability and licensure. Electricians, plumbers, nurses, and inspectors carry responsibility that a system cannot hold. Someone has to sign, and someone has to be accountable. And it requires trust with a person. Care work, teaching, negotiation, anything where the relationship is the product. Now let me be honest about the trades specifically, because they get recommended constantly, and usually badly. They are genuinely in demand, and the demographics support that. A large share of skilled tradespeople are approaching retirement, and the pipeline behind them is thin. Union apprenticeships in particular are one of the few remaining paths where you earn while you learn and come out with no debt and a portable credential. But the trades are hard on the body, and anyone recommending them without saying so is not being straight with you. Knees, backs, and shoulders. If you are considering this in your 50s, think seriously about the version of the trade that keeps you working at 65. Estimating, inspection, project management, service work rather than new construction, or eventually owning the business rather than swinging the hammer. And there is a category people overlook entirely: the maintenance and repair of the infrastructure everyone is currently building. All those facilities need electricians, HVAC technicians, control specialists, and industrial mechanics permanently in places where nobody currently lives. That work is not going anywhere, and it pays. Healthcare is the other obvious one, and the range is wider than people think. Not every path requires a 4-year degree. Respiratory therapy, radiologic technology, surgical technology, sonography, dental hygiene, and physical therapy assistants are all 2-year programs with real wages and genuine demand driven by an aging population that is not going to stop aging. 2 practical notes: if you are over 50 and considering a change, look at community colleges rather than 4-year programs, because the cost differential is enormous, and employers in these fields care about the credential and the clinical hours, not the prestige of the institution. And look into whether your state has a workforce development program that will pay for retraining. Most do, funded federally, routed through local workforce boards, and chronically underused. Search for your state plus Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. The money exists and almost nobody applies for it. The last thing he said he wanted to write about was why nobody is having children. I want to include one more thing, because when he was asked what he would do if he could not fail, the answer was not about markets at all, and I think it is the most revealing moment in the whole conversation. He said he would want to write something like Silent Spring. Rachel Carson's book from 1962, which did what books almost never do, which is change policy and change how a whole country thought about something. He wants to write about toxicity and about the social contract, and specifically about nurturing a family. And then this, we have got to find in the end a community that encourages children. The downside of the brutally efficient capitalist system we have, with its focus on financial achievement, is very little emphasis on community and child rearing. And if we do not fix that, we fail as a society pretty quickly. We have to detoxify. We have to create an environment where people want to have children. Now, that is a striking thing for a professional investor to identify as the most important problem, and I think he is pointing at something real that deserves to be taken seriously rather than turned into a political argument. The American fertility rate has fallen to roughly 1.6 births per woman, well below the replacement level of about 2.1, and it has been declining for years. That is not unique to America. It is happening across the developed world, but the American version has specific features. And when researchers actually ask people why, the answers are remarkably consistent and remarkably unromantic. Cost, housing, childcare, healthcare, job insecurity, the absence of paid leave, the sense that they cannot provide what they think a child requires, that is worth sitting with. People are not declining to have children because they do not want them. Surveys consistently find that Americans report wanting more children than they actually have. There is a documented gap between desired family size and achieved family size, and that gap is filled with economics. So when he talks about creating an environment where people want to have children, he is not making a moral argument about family values. He is making a structural one. A society that makes having a child financially catastrophic will get fewer children, and then it will discover that it needed them because every retirement system, every healthcare system, and every tax base in the developed world was built on the assumption of a rough demographic balance. And the word toxicity is doing real work in that sentence too. He means it in at least two senses. The literal one. The chemical environment we have built, most of which was never tested for long-term effects on human health, and some of which has documented associations with developmental and reproductive outcomes. That was Carson's subject, and it has only grown, and the social one, an environment that is toxic to family formation, where the two-income household is not a choice but a requirement, where the cost of care exceeds what one of those incomes produces, where there is no national paid leave, where a maternal mortality rate is the worst in the developed world by 55%, where housing near decent schools costs more than a young family can carry. You can arrange all of those individually and defensively and end up with a country that has, without ever deciding to, made having children an act of financial courage. I do not have a policy fix to hand you, and I am not going to pretend I do. But I will say what I think is the honest takeaway for a person watching this. If you have young adults in your family who are hesitating about children and you find yourself frustrated with them, consider that they are looking at the same arithmetic you would look at and that the arithmetic genuinely changed. It is not a failure of will or a lack of values. Childcare costs more than college tuition in more than half the states. That was not true when you were deciding. And if you are in a position to make it easier for a young family, whether that is watching grandchildren, helping with a down payment, or simply not adding pressure, understand that you are not indulging anyone. You are performing the function that other countries perform through policy, and that in this country falls entirely on families, which is the whole theme of this video. Make friends is the most important financial advice in this entire conversation. Let me finish where he finished, because the last two pieces of advice are the ones that sound softest and are actually the hardest and most consequential. Make friends. Make sure you live in a tight society if you can. And when asked why America is a difficult place to be if things go wrong, the answer was this: because your neighbors are not as interested in you and your well-being. That is a lonely place to be. And when you are in trouble, you are in serious trouble, because the safety net here is very ineffective. I want you to notice that this was said in the middle of financial advice by a man discussing portfolio construction, and that it was not a change of subject. Here is why it belongs there. In a country with a strong safety net, when something goes wrong, an institution catches you. You lose a job. There is unemployment insurance that actually replaces a meaningful share of income. You get sick. Treatment does not bankrupt you. You have a child. You get paid leave. In a country with a weak safety net, when something goes wrong, the thing that catches you is other people. The neighbor who drives you to chemotherapy. The friend who watches your kids while you interview. The brother-in-law who knows a guy hiring. The church that brings meals. Which means that in America specifically, relationships are not a lifestyle preference. They are infrastructure. They are the functional replacement for a public system that does not exist here at the scale it exists elsewhere. And that reframes what it means to have withdrawn socially, which an enormous number of people have done, particularly people under financial pressure because money troubles produce shame and shame produces isolation. When you stop returning calls because you are embarrassed about your situation, you are not just becoming lonely, you are disassembling the only safety net you actually have. And then there was the harder question. Should Dave or Jenny or Clive consider leaving? His answer was that it is a perfectly reasonable thing to consider, and that in the things that really matter, life expectancy, health, safety nets, murder rates, mortality rates, several other countries are day and night better. And that in the things that look splashy, America generates enormous wealth that goes to a relatively small fraction of people, which flatters the average while the bottom quartile does poorly. I am not going to tell you to leave your country. I would not tell anyone that. But I do want to say two honest things about it. The first is that emigration is far harder than the internet suggests. Visas, work authorization, healthcare qualification periods, language, professional credentials that do not transfer, currency risk on your retirement savings, and the fact that your family is here. For most people over 50, it is not realistic, and people who romanticize it are usually people who have not attempted it. The second is that the underlying insight still applies even if you never move a mile. He was not really recommending a country. He was identifying variables. Is there a functioning safety net? Is there a community that will actually catch you? Is the cost of living survivable? Are the mortality numbers decent? Those variables differ enormously within the United States. Between states, between counties, between towns, healthcare access, cost of living, and social density are wildly different in different American places, and moving within this country is dramatically more achievable than moving out of it. So the useful version of that question is not should I leave America? It is, does the specific place I live have the things that will catch me if something goes wrong, and if not, is there somewhere within reach that does? And if the answer is that your town is thin on all of it, then the alternative is not to move. It is to build the thing that is missing, which is what the last piece of advice was actually about. Let me leave you with what I think the whole thing amounts to. Life in America is about to get harder, and the specific instructions are boring and unglamorous, and completely within your reach. Build cash. Reduce fixed obligations. Look at what you actually own and understand that 35% of it may be 7 companies. Learn something that needs hands and presence and judgment. And stop treating your relationships as the thing you get to after the important things, because in a country with this safety net, they are the important thing. The people who come through hard periods are almost never the ones with the most money. They are the ones who saw it early, adjusted quietly while it was still cheap to adjust, and had somebody to call. Be one of those. Take care of yourselves out there. And if you take one thing from this and do it this week, make it the smallest one on the list. Call somebody you have not spoken to in a while. Not for any reason, that is the whole point.